Hello, hello, Charles Lancaster here. We're here today in Chevy Chase Circle, and we're going to speak with a good friend of mine, Milton Grenfell, one of the truly great residential architects here in Washington, D.C. Let's stop by his office. It's just down the street. Welcome to the show, Milton.
And welcome to my Temple of the Muses.
Milton Grenfell.
Yes, Charles.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So architecture. How did you get into architecture, Milton?
Well, as I've told you before, I had a treehouse I built in my backyard when I was a boy, and I built it over successive summers, you might say, to where it was about to be, I think, about a 9-story treehouse, and it went up one tree, and then it spanned across to another tree that was about 12 feet away. And went up that tree. So it got to be quite a big affair. And I did all this without benefit of a structural analysis. So the fact that I'm here today shows the power of just intuitive structural analysis.
Of an 8 and 9-year-old.
I was precocious, I must be.
How did an 8 or 9-year-old architect in Mississippi end up in Washington, D.C.?
Well, I wound up getting a job in the Carolinas. And so I moved to the Carolinas, started my own practice there. And my practice spread. Pretty soon I was doing projects in upstate New York, down to the Gulf Coast, and all points in between. And so we had friends here and had come here quite a bit from North Carolina. We'd come here for shows, and my wife's an artist, come to the National Gallery for exhibits of various sorts.
You drive here?
We drive.
So what is a drive from?
It's about 8 hours.
About 8 hours.
Depends on traffic, could be more.
You were near Hilton Head?
No, we were in Charlotte.
In Charlotte.
But we did that. We were doing the drive a lot, and so we thought, well, let's go to Washington. It's sort of central. It was a good in-between point. And also at the time, there was a little group of classicists here, people who were trying to get the federal government to be more in tune with doing classical buildings like we had done since the founding, instead of these modernist buildings like the new East Wing of the National Gallery, for instance. There was a nucleus of people that were all about what I'm about, and so it just seemed like a very hospitable place to be, where we could kind of magnify our efforts. Down outside of Washington, you always felt like you were, an uphill battle because you didn't have much in the way of kindred spirits. Mm-hmm. But here we found there was quite a collection of classicists, probably because it's a classical city. Maybe that's what brought them here, or maybe it's just
a lot of Roman and Greek temples. I mean, the
absolutely.
Lincoln Memorial is that?
It's a Greek temple, basically. Yeah. That's what brought us up here, and it's a good place for classicism.
Was the National Civic Art Society, was that something?
That was gelling at the time I moved up here, and I was part of all that becoming a
Were you a founder of it?
Yeah.
We got the Blair House there.
Yeah, this is the Blair House. It's the guest quarters for the White House, right across the street. This is an idea I came up with for the dining room. As a way to accommodate the paneling down below. So we took this 18th century paneling and tried to fit it better into a very tall room. So we coved the ceiling, which in a sense brings the ceiling down to where the wall is lowered. And then we put a really substantial architrave on top of the paneling in plaster to separate it from the woodwork.
So this is the paneling.
Right, with just a square.
Jackie O.
Correct.
Salvaged.
Correct.
Who did the drawings?
Well, we did. The office did them. Yeah, watercolor.
These are beautiful details here.
Oh, thank you.
Why is New York a home of classicism?
Probably Henry Hope Reed. He started Classical America back in the 1960s, I think, he started the organization Classical America there. And so
Henry Hope Reed.
Yes, and that became the nucleus. His wife was a writer for the New Yorker magazine, Talk of the Town. Okay. A Marylander, as a matter of fact. And the funny thing about that article is I had read it in the New Yorker. And,
an article by Henry Hope Reed.
It was an article talking about him, and he was on the same page as I, of course, or I was on the same page as him. So I contacted him, and he got in touch with me and was just delighted to hear from me. because he was a voice in the wilderness at that time, without question. He had like one or two disciples, one of whom was John Blateau and also Alvin Home in Philadelphia. They're both Philadelphia architects. And he said, you've got to come study with Alvin Home. So Henry in Classical America gave me a little stipend to go and spend a few weeks in 2 separate occasions with an interval between to study with Alvin Home in Philadelphia. So I did that. And
this is in the 60s, 70s?
I think the early 90s maybe.
The early 90s.
I think, or late 80s.
Okay, in the 80s.
Yeah. We're losing track of time here. But anyway.
You were in school?
No, I was practicing architecture in North Carolina. I had broken off from the modernist firms I was with and wanted to do traditional architecture. I started my own, and I just was doing little house projects, little addition renovations, whoever walked in the door. So you got to D.C. Yeah.
And could you talk a little bit about Prince Charles and Poundbury?
Well, let me back up. There's a British architect named Robert Adam, who also has found his way to classicism about the same time I had. And when we had our first classical conference since before World War II, in Alexandria in the 80s, I think it was, maybe early 90s, excuse me. Anyway, the dawn of it all. Robert Adam, people were in contact with him. Really, the Notre Dame people were in contact with him. They had started a little bit of classicism there. They got a new dean, and he just wanted to transform the thing into something classical. Basically, he knew the British crowd that was starting to blossom. There were 2 or 3 of them, and so he came over to the conference, Robert Adam, and we had a great time. It was maybe 40 of us, I guess, at that point, from all over the country, and it's grown since then. We have a headquarters in New York. We have got tutorial sessions, publications. It's really quite a robust organization.
So traditional architecture is doing better now than it was in the 70s.
Oh, it was just a seed of a nothing at that time.
And the big one of the incubator labs, if you could speak like that, would be Notre Dame and
Notre Dame was key,
in South Bend, Indiana.
Yeah. They
why is that? Why Notre Dame? What was going on there?
Okay, let me get the reference here. Thomas Gordon Smith,
building classical America.
Yep. The late Thomas Gordon Smith.
A vision of Europe and America.
Yeah. So when Thomas Gordon Smith got to Notre Dame, which happened just a couple of years before this book came out, he started to turn the school into at least offering a classical instruction, much to the chagrin of a lot of the faculty, I might add. So he had kind of a battle on his hands. But he battled on and got more and more professors, 2 and 3, would join him there at Notre Dame, traditional architects. And Notre Dame really became the nucleus of our revival. And we continue to have our conferences on an annual basis, really back in those days. And we don't do it as much now. I think we needed it then. There were so few of us. Well, we have enough classical architects in Washington, we can meet locally and have our events, which we do.
Yeah.
But back in the day, that wasn't a possibility. You had to go worldwide to get enough classes to fill a conference room.
So in a sense, you've succeeded.
Oh yeah,
because it's now more mainstream.
Yeah.
No, it's more. Was it not acceptable at some point? It was considered.
Architects. I don't think they would even want to do it if they even could. It was considered like almost immoral or something to do traditional architecture. Now that being said, there were practicing traditional architects, but they were well underground. There were little pockets of them, actually. There was a Georgia school, which Henry Hope Reed documented, and there are a number of books out. These were old guys, though. These were guys who were my parents' age, who kept doing traditional architecture right on through the 50s and 60s and 70s, when they tended to, I think, fade out because they died, but they got old in the 80s. But anyway, things really turned around blessedly before he passed on, because he had fought. He was just a voice in the wilderness, for so long. It was extraordinary.
Did the schools of architecture change?
Oh, absolutely. You know what? The Germans came over from when Hitler took over. A lot of the German classicists, or excuse me, modernists, fled, like Mies van der Rohe, Marcel Breuer. This crowd came over to America, and Americans, as we want to do, think, oh well, Europe's, they're the best, the genuflected. They thought this is what we need to be doing. So
this was a result of World War II.
Yeah,
really,
absolutely. They all came over and took over the Harvard was taking MIT, some of the schools, and in the course of the 50s, they had pretty much driven out all the classical instruction, and young modernist types were ruling the roost.
And that impacted government buildings.
Totally. Oh yeah, totally.
Government patronage.
Everything
is completely linked to the Ivy League. The Ivy League schools.
It did. Yeah.
And Notre Dame was not an Ivy League. That was an outlier.
You're right.
So maybe that's one of the reasons why this revival came from outside of the so-called Ivy League.
I should give a little credit where credit is due. Yale had a professor, Charles Moore, who was an eccentric sort of chap, and he was really one of the people that launched postmodernism, which was important because it showed you could do buildings that weren't sterile. They would throw columns around, they would throw dentelated cornices around, they'd throw pediments around, and it was a mix mash of stuff.
Could you name some postmodernist buildings that would be iconic Washington D.C. postmodernism?
Let me think if we have some here. We probably do, but I
Washington Harbor.
No, I wouldn't call it that.
What would you call Washington Harbor? Because you got columns left and right and different styles.
Okay, you're probably right. I would call it a very unschooled use of classical orders in sort of a feckless kind of decorative way.
I thought that was the definition of postmodernism.
I guess I think of it as a phase, because serious architects like Charles Moore, even Bob Stern, I would say at that time, was postmodern. They started to use the order again, but in a kind of a playful, dissonant way, really. I mean, it
had a lighthearted and a whimsy to it.
Yeah, it did. And one almost could say an irreverence to it as well, too, which I, never cared for. But anyway, that went on. Like Piazza d'Italia in New Orleans by Charles Moore got a lot of attention. Seaside, Leon Creer's work at Seaside has a postmodern quality to it. A lot of Seaside is postmodern.
So this was a movement that was happening inside of the United States and in England and in Europe.
Yeah.
And somehow Prince Charles got wrapped up in this.
Prince Charles absolutely caught on to traditional art and architecture. He wrote a book called A Vision for England. And he talked about what a disaster London was looking like. You have a picture of London pre-modernist era, and then he showed London now with the spike buildings coming up, weird looking things. And he said it looks like, it looked like a carbuncle on the face of a beloved friend, and the horrible addition by the Philadelphia firm, the horrible addition of the art museum in London. The British Art Museum, which is a horrible addition.
Oh yeah. What do you think of the Norman Foster? That big, what's that big spiral? It looks like a torpedo.
Right.
What is that called? The Gherkin.
Well, it's forgettable. It's depressing. Yeah.
Well, I don't know. We do live in a modern world, and I think that Norman Foster also designed here in Washington, the courtyard to the portrait gallery. In D.C., Norman Foster's team designed City Center with Hines,
I didn't know that.
The commercial real estate company, Hines, the ceiling of the portrait gallery.
Yeah,
architecture. It's an entire different worldview, and I think we want to bring it back today. I think to residential architecture, and when it comes to people's homes, many people like more traditional. They may go to an office that's super contemporary, but when they come home, a lot of folk want to be in a home that's a more traditional home. Is that something you've noticed?
Yeah, the taste for traditional architecture has never really died. I mean, among the vast public. It was only really our trend-setting, taste-setting elite that really embraced modernism. Most houses are traditional. I would say they're not very good traditional anymore. I think when architects were still doing it, good architects were still doing traditional architecture pre-World War II, they kind of set the pace, they set the standard very high, and even just what you call merchant builders, you know, that just knocked out houses, did subdivisions. Even they did good subdivisions. You know, I live in a 1930s subdivision. The houses are quite nice, good traditional detailing. But when the elite embraced modernism, the average builder kind of know where to go, and so they just started using plan book stuff, and the quality of the architecture, it wasn't modernism, no one wanted it, but the quality of the traditional architecture went downhill pretty fast when real high quality work was no longer being done and up there in work. But I think that's that's changed in my lifetime. I mean, now there are any number of good traditional architects doing houses. I mean, a lot of them doing houses. Tends to be for very wealthy people, not for builders, unfortunately. Got involved with traditional neighborhood design work with Andreas Dewani, and we were doing a lot of traditional house designs and
here
commercial buildings in America.
In Washington? The neighborhood planning, where was that done?
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't work on the Washington projects. I did one in Virginia, but not in the two Washington area projects, because Kentlands is the best known.
Could you tell us about Kentlands a little bit?
Kentlands was the first traditional neighborhood development. I would say second one. The first was Seaside. I think the second one was Kentlands. They built a complete village there. It's got commercial, institutional, educational, and houses. Multifamily, single family.
And for our audience, where is Kentlands?
Kentlands, it's north of Washington, probably a 20-minute drive north, due north, right off the interstate. It's been a hell of a success. And they then went and did I think it's Lakelands, just up the road, up the same interstate. Dewani Pater Zybrick did that as well. And that's been a great success. So I think all of the neighborhood projects I've done have really flourished. People really appreciate living in a traditional place. It's the way our human habitat evolved. It took the modernist movement to detach us from our natural ways and push us into these very artificial ways, which just really haven't proven to be very successful.
Well, particularly the U.S., our zoning is, we have, the zoning was driven by roads and cars. You have, this is where you work, this is the office.
You got it.
This is where we shop.
You got it.
And this is where you live, and this is where you go to church.
Highways. Yeah.
And this is where your kids go to school. And you will spend your time in a car.
You got it.
Driving between these different locations.
You've got it. Yeah, that was the model.
That's America. And then could you tell us a little bit about the drawings you did in Baltimore? And I'm particularly interested in that because my dad ran a place called the Peabody Bookshop. And so I grew up in that neighborhood by Reed and Charles Street. I think the site was really dedicated to sort of a contemporary apartment building.
Right.
And so you came up with some concept drawings. Corner of Reed and Charles Street, it's a, 12-story, 10-story building. Out of what, the 1920s? What's the vibe there?
We looked to the 1920s. I mean, it was a great year for American architecture, in particular commercial office buildings. I mean, this nation is blessed with downtowns that almost always have some of these, where they may be in a very small town that may only have a 3 or 4 story one, or it could be in New York or Chicago that has a 50, 60 story one, but still, they're lovely. We know them. They're all usually, they're masonry, they're not steel and glass. They're punched openings, they have ornament, especially at the bottom level, an ornament at the very top perhaps, and well proportioned, and they're just lovely. So we thought, let's do something like that for this site. Let's look back at the buildings we all love and do it again.
Maybe one day the Peabody Bookshop will be on the ground floor of that building on Charles Street. I don't know. We
got the plans ready.
The real estate market in Baltimore is really struggling. It's not a city on the rebound, and now we've got the Francis Scott Key Bridge going down, and Baltimore is not having a boom in housing, unlike places like Loudoun County.
Yeah.
What about, we've also talked a little bit about Southern Maryland. and not going into any particulars, but what are your thoughts about the general sort of southern Maryland, Charles County, St. Mary's County, Calvert County?
Yeah, okay, this is so this is a book, it was, I think, Vanity Press by Henry Chanley Foreman. He was a architect and architecture historian in Maryland going back into the 1930s, and he was a very early preservationist. So despite the modernist era of the time, which really had no regard for traditional architecture at all, tear it down, let's build something new, he was against the stream, swam against the stream. And so he would drive around Maryland with his daughters, and they would measure and draw and photograph all these lovely old Maryland houses. He did it for decades. And luckily, he published the books, and I have a few of them, thankfully. And they're just treasures. It's really a labor of love on his part. But a lot of these buildings are now dust, rubble, they're gone. So thank goodness he got to them back in the 40s and 30s before they met their fate.
There's a historic farm called Mulberry Fields that's for sale right now. It's on the market. And
where is it?
It's in St. Mary's County. It's probably in this book. I'm gonna stand up and see if it's here.
Mulberry Fields?
See if it's in here.
Yeah. Check it out. I can check the other ones too.
So this is this historic Maryland homes. I wonder if it's even in the. I think it's in St. Mary's County. So
look at those maps you drew. Isn't that marvelous?
Yeah. So we have Washington D.C. and Baltimore. But if you go back to the founding of Maryland, this down here is St. Clement's Island. That's 1634. That's when Leonard Calvert and Father Andrew White, who was an English Jesuit. This is when the Jesuits came over with the Calvert family.
There's a cross
at St. Clement's Island.
There you go. Yeah.
So this is really the founding of Maryland here.
Absolutely.
Calvert County, St. Mary's County, Charles County, and there are all these historic homes scattered around here, built under the feudal manorial system because the Calvert family ran Maryland as a feudal proprietary colony. The King of England gave them a grant, and they carved it out of Virginia. So that's the old State House that was restored. That was rebuilt in the 1930s. They moved the state capital from St. Mary's City to Annapolis, which was called Anne Arundel Town, when the Protestants took over the management of Maryland. I think maybe 1720s. But let's look if Mulberry Field is in here. It's Mulberry Field here, 5352.
Good, very good.
Here we go. Look at that.
Excellent.
Plot plan 1 mile long of Mulberry Field.
Amazing. What an axis, huh?
Look at that. Look at that. So the Potomac River's here, and they have this long drive, and their orchard, the gardens, the plantation house.
And look how it corrects for perspective. So when you enter, it doesn't look like things are closing in on you down here.
Yeah.
It actually looks like it's good and probably looks horizontal or parallel to each other. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's an optical device so you don't feel it's being pinched, the house.
Yeah.
You know?
Huh. What's the time? When was this built? Does it say? 1760.
You know, it's
So right
amazing.
around the-
This person must have spent time like in France or someplace in Europe. The guy who saw that idea, because that's not that common.
Yeah.
It's not English, that sort of perspective.
Well, there's the old State House in here. Site of St. Mary's City, 30. Let's look at that. You don't have a map of Maryland here, do you?
No, I probably do.
I think people should know this. It's real history of Maryland. Maryland, D.C., Loudoun. Probably this will have it. Let's see here. That's very D.C. focused.
Yeah, I should have a, yeah.
New Jersey.
Sorry about that.
It's okay. Washington, D.C. North, Montgomery County.
New Jersey, Alabama, nothing here. Got all these bits and pieces.
Beltway.
Yeah.
You know what? Let's go back to the map that was in the damn book.
The hand-drawn map.
Yeah. Let's go back to the hand-drawn map. So that's a perfect map.
Yeah.
So here we go. We have St. Mary City, the governor's castle, St. Mary City here, which is kind of like Charleston. You know, Charleston was at the mouth of a
peninsula.
of a peninsula.
The mouth of rivers.
So, you know, Maryland could have had its capital as St. Mary City.
Why did they move it?
Because the Protestants took over.
I see.
Because when the politics changed in England, when Oliver Cromwell took over, his guys shut down Maryland, and it became illegal to be Catholic in Maryland. So if you were Catholic in Maryland during that time of Cromwell, you could be arrested for worshiping in public.
Amazing.
And so some of these old families would build their chapels as part of their church, which is why Point Lookout, Thomas Stone, that was technically a house, the Jesuit residence there. And then up at DeRegan Manor, Charles Carroll, signer of the Declaration,
of course, yeah.
they have a chapel there as part of DeRegan Manor. My parents were married there.
Amazing.
In DeRegan Manor.
Yeah.
In Howard County. Charles Carroll owned, you know, he was Irish. He owned a huge chunk of
Yeah, it was a land grant, wasn't it, from the king?
Yeah.
Well,
so they moved. I'm going to get back to the thing. So they moved the capital from St. Mary's up to Annapolis, and they called it Anne Arundel Town. And then they changed it to Annapolis, which was a more sort of Greek. And one of the things they did is in St. Mary's City, the State House and the church were very separated. But if you go to Annapolis, you'll notice the church and the State House are right next to each other.
Right.
And it's an Episcopal church.
Right.
Church of England next to the State House.
It's interesting. Maybe it's for defense reasons. I mean, this is kind of vulnerable to a naval attack, isn't it?
Yeah,
Whereas
you're right.
Up here, you had time to.
And it was closer to Baltimore. Nice. How about looking around your office here?
Yeah, sure.
We,
Help yourself.